A man who had close to 90 allegations out of 4 different jurisdictions and ultimately ended up with 34 convictions after a jury was able to hear all the evidence would possibly be committing a criminal act on January 6th. In fact, considering the fact that we are now under the impression that he is violating people's due process rights, he is ignoring court orders, he's starting wars without congressional authority in contradiction to the Constitution. He's enriching himself to the tune of over $1.4 billion. He's shaking down electeds to draw maps that will help him stay in power because the Republicans don't understand that they swore an oath to the Constitution and that we are supposed to do checks and balances. He's also shaking down TV stations to get money. So why are we trying to pretend as if it is out of the realm for this particular man to commit the crime that he committed on January 6th, and frankly, the only reason he ran for president was to make sure that he would not be prosecuted. But for Mr. Trump's election and imminent return to the presidency, the office assessed that the admissible evidence was sufficient to obtain and sustain a conviction at trial. It's curious because you've sat here all day, and thank you so much for showing up because this was something that you wanted to do. The Republicans wanted to make sure that you were hid in a room with no cameras because I was there. They didn't really want you out public because they were afraid of what you would say, which is that you could have proven your case because you are a career prosecutor who knows how to prosecute criminals. So just to be clear, today it seems like the Republicans have not really fought very much about whether or not Trump was guilty or not. In fact, their fight seems to be over whether or not you were authorized to prove their guilt. Do you recall a number of Republican members asking about whether or not your appointment was okay, even though we know that you've testified about the more than 100-year precedent that allowed for your appointment?
I was asked questions about that today, and our position, as we filed in our appeal, is that there was strong support for my appointment, including Supreme Court precedent directly on point.
Thank you so much. Additionally, you know, everybody's been all gingerly here today, but I don't know why we're acting surprised that a man who had close to 90 allegations out of 4 different jurisdictions and ultimately ended up with 34 convictions after a jury was able to hear all the evidence would possibly be committing a criminal act on January 6th. In fact, considering the fact that we are now under the impression that he is violating people's due process rights, he is ignoring court orders, he's starting wars without congressional authority in contradiction to the Constitution. He's enriching himself to the tune of over $1.4 billion. He's shaking down electeds to draw maps that will help him stay in power because the Republicans don't understand that they swore an oath to the Constitution and that we are supposed to do checks and balances. He's also shaking down TV stations to get money. So why are we trying to pretend as if it is out of the realm for this particular man to commit the crime that he committed on January 6th, and frankly, the only reason he ran for president was to make sure that he would not be prosecuted because I fully believe that you would have put him under the jail based on our long-form conversation that we had. But according to your special counsel report on page 137, it states the department's view that the Constitution prohibits the continued indictment and prosecution of a president is categorical and does not turn on the gravity of the crimes charged, the strength of the government's proof, or the merits of the prosecution. And that, quote, but for Mr. Trump's election and imminent return to the presidency, the office assessed that the admissible evidence was sufficient to obtain and sustain a conviction at trial. In other words, Donald Trump ran for president, like I said, so he wouldn't have to spend the rest of his life in prison. The chairman and other members of this committee have spent all day attacking you and trying to rewrite the history of January 6th.
This wasn't just another congressional hearing. It was a direct accusation that one of the most powerful men in America may have used political power to avoid legal accountability. And that's exactly what made this exchange so explosive. The Congresswoman wasn't debating whether January 6 happened. She wasn't questioning whether investigations took place. Her argument was far more dramatic, that the evidence against Donald Trump was strong enough to bring the case to trial, but his return to the presidency changed the legal reality. That is an extraordinary claim. According to her argument, this isn't simply a story about politics. It's a story about power. specifically whether political power can place someone beyond the reach of the justice system. You can hear the frustration in her voice. This wasn't the tone of someone discussing a routine legal disagreement. It was the tone of someone who believes accountability was interrupted before the legal process could fully run its course. At the heart of her message is a question that reaches far beyond Donald Trump. If an ordinary citizen faced allegations of this magnitude, would they have already had their day in court? For many Americans, that's where this debate becomes emotional. People may disagree about Trump's innocence or guilt, but most agree on one principle: justice should not operate under different rules for different people. Trump's supporters, however, see the situation very differently. They argue that allegations are not convictions, that voters were fully aware of the investigations and still chose Trump, and that political opponents have spent years trying to defeat him through courtrooms as well as elections. And that's exactly why this issue remains so divisive. Because beneath the headlines lies a much larger question, one that goes beyond any single politician, investigation, or election. Can political power influence legal accountability? Can prosecutors pursue powerful figures without being accused of political bias? And can the public still trust the outcome when politics and the justice system collide? Those are the questions hanging over this entire debate. The Congresswoman's most striking claim came near the end, when she suggested that Trump's campaign for the presidency was about more than winning office. It was also about avoiding prosecution. Whether viewers agree with that accusation or reject it completely, it remains one of the most consequential claims made during the hearing. Because if political power can affect accountability, public trust begins to erode. But if legal investigations are seen as political weapons, trust suffers as well. And that is the dilemma at the center of this controversy. What happened next, however, may have been even more revealing. Because the debate didn't end with this accusation. It quickly shifted to an even bigger argument about January 6, presidential power, and whether the legal system was ever going to get the chance to test these claims in court. Take a look at what happened next.
But Mr. Jim Jordan, the chairman, failed to mention how he was running around the Capitol terrified by the possibility that all those insurrectionists would harm him. In fact, on page 97 of the deposition transcript, you mentioned how Mark Meadows, the president's chief of staff, quote unquote, never saw Jim Jordan so scared. The chairman also failed to mention that he was in direct contact with the White House in the days leading up to and on January 6th, which is why his toll records were subpoenaed by your office. Let me be clear, because they're trying to act like this is Democrats on Republicans, and I guess you are a covert Democrat that knew that he was going to try to steal an election before he tried to steal that election, and so therefore you were somehow put into place. I mean, the conspiracy theories make your head spin, but nevertheless, were you going to subpoena the toll records of every single Republican simply because they were a Republican?
No. We subpoenaed the toll records in the course of this investigation because they were relevant to our investigation.
Relevant. Oh, okay. All right. So that means something about facts. So let's talk about facts. Donald Trump lost to Joe Biden, yes or no?
That's correct.
Okay. In fact, 60 federal and state courts have found that there was no evidence of election fraud. Trump's own attorney general and vice president knew that he lost the election, but he still tried to steal the election by pressuring state officials, designing fake elector plans, nearly having Mike Pence hanged, and ultimately demanding that his supporters, quote, fight like hell, correct?
Correct.
We all saw it happen once they reached We all saw what happened once they reached the U.S. Capitol. As your report outlines, President Trump knew that he would incite violence at the Capitol that day. In fact, some of Trump's senior advisors were pushing for violence. For example, page 81 of the report details how co-conspirators number 2, John Eastman, tried to convince Mike Pence to break the law, stating that, quote, violence was necessary. So it isn't just Trump who is responsible for the death of multiple law enforcement officers and the injuries of thousands of people. A lot of Republican members of Congress are also responsible. 147 Republicans voted to overturn the 2020 election results, including multiple members currently serving on this committee. And I will.
This wasn't just another congressional hearing. This was a political collision. A room that started with questions about subpoenas suddenly turned into a courtroom of public opinion, where one side wasn't just criticizing Donald Trump, they were arguing that one of the darkest chapters in modern American politics was never an accident. And from the very first minute, you could feel the tension. The congressman wasn't throwing out random accusations. He came armed with testimony, court rulings, phone records, official investigations, and statements from people who were inside the White House when the 2020 election crisis unfolded. Then came the question that stopped everything. Did Donald Trump lose the 2020 election? No hesitation. No dodging. No political spin. The witness answered. That's correct. For me, that was the moment this hearing exploded. Because after that answer, the conversation wasn't really about election fraud anymore. It became a fight over something much bigger. If Trump lost, then what happened after the election? The congressman argued that court after court rejected attempts to overturn the result, that officials inside Trump's own administration accepted Biden's victory. Yet, according to the argument presented in the hearing, efforts to challenge the outcome continued anyway. And that's why this exchange felt different. This wasn't politicians yelling over each other for TV cameras. This was an attempt to build a narrative of responsibility using official records, sworn testimony, and documented events. Of course, millions of Trump supporters completely reject that interpretation. They argue every candidate has the constitutional right to challenge an election, that concerns about election integrity deserve to be investigated, and that questioning the system should not automatically be treated as an attempt to destroy it. And that's exactly why America is still divided. Because the argument isn't only about what happened on January 6th. It's about what those events actually mean. To one side, January 6th represents a dangerous breakdown of democratic norms. To the other, it represents years of unanswered questions and a political system they believe refused to listen. That's why this issue refuses to disappear. It's no longer just history. It's become a battle over history itself. But here's what stood out to me. The hearing wasn't asking Americans to relive January 6th. It was asking them to decide how they should judge it. Who knew what? Who encouraged what? Who crossed the line? And where should accountability begin and end? Because when the shouting fades and the headlines disappear, that's the question history will keep asking. Not who won the loudest argument. Not who scored the best political soundbite. But whether the actions taken after one of the closest watched elections in American history strengthened public trust or deepened one of the greatest political divides the country has ever faced. And judging by this hearing, that debate is far from over. If you found this video informative, don't forget to hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more breaking political news and in-depth analysis. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.